Hey there, welcome to the Theology of podcast. I'm Benjamin.
And I'm Riker.
And we're two college students who love studying scripture and having meaningful biblical conversations.
When we think about theology, most of our thoughts probably stay within the four walls of the church. But in doing so, we're really limiting our understanding of God's infinite nature.
And so each episode will be tackling an everyday, secular-seeming topic and discussing what the faith has to say about it both conceptually and practically.
So thanks so much for joining us. Make sure to buckle up, keep your hands and feet inside the proverbial vehicle at all times, and enjoy the ride.
Let's go.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Theology of. We are so thankful for each and every one of you. Thankful for you joining us, especially this time as we talk about the theology of beauty with John Higgins from the YouTube channel, The Bible is Art. So welcome to the podcast, John.
Hey, thanks so much, guys. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really excited about what you guys are doing.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. We appreciate that. So like I said, we're going to be talking about the theology of beauty. And this is an area that John has looked into a lot. So for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with you, could you maybe tell us about your background and specifically your background with this topic?
Sure. Yeah. So I first got interested in this. I was in school, in college. I studied philosophy and Bible, and I think it was just the way that God created me. I started becoming fascinated by beauty, and like beauty in all of its forms, visual beauty, and the plastic arts, or musical beauty, or all of these things. And it was fascinating because when you have conversations with people, just regular questions, and I found they're normally very sort of solid about the objectivity of 2 out of the 3 of the transcendentals, truth, beauty, and goodness. These features of reality that insofar as something exists, it has this property, right? For something to exist, it has to have truth, beauty, and goodness about it. And when you talk to just normal Christians like us, they'd be like, oh yeah, like truth, definitely, that's very important. It'd be like goodness, like morality, that absolutely is important. It exists. And then you get to beauty, and all of a sudden there's this like haziness, like there's an imprecision, there's a real lack of clarity as to whether it's objective at all. There's a lack of understanding about its nature. And so I just found that I found that there was one of those things that just like put it in the back of my mind, and it was just always kind of sitting there for a while. And then I was teaching in a Christian high school, and I was teaching a senior class, and it was essentially like a worldview class. And in this class, one of the sections we had on our like final paper was a Christian view of fill in the blank. It was kind of like your podcast, And so, and I was trying to fill out bibliographies for my students. So like, hey, when you're preparing for this topic, read these books. And so it was, we had a Christian view of economics and mathematics, and one of them was beauty. As I would compile these, I found that the only types of material that were out there were very, very high level and abstract. I don't mean this in a negative sense. That's good, but I was reading these, and essentially they were some form of, hey, beauty's important. Here's examples of beautiful things in the Bible. Here's kind of the effects of beauty. And I would always like be going through these and being like, okay, well, what is beauty? Right? Like, what is it? But then you would, turn over to like your ethics book, your theological ethics thing. And it's like, oh, we're going to go through like, these are the major accounts of what makes something right or wrong. And here is the biblical position, right? They would always have that same form. It was like kind of obvious. But for some reason, when you get to the literature on beauty, it was like, not there. Okay, so here's the last part of the story. So as my life moved on, I moved out of teaching and I moved into design. And so then I'm, consuming all of this literature from formal design, graphic design and web design and stuff like this. And the fascinating thing is that when you get in there, there's all of these, in any book you open up, there are all of these properties that everyone accepts as like, these are the properties of what makes something designed well or beautiful. And it's like completely accepted that this is. Now, of course, if you would push those people and say, oh, is this like objective? Well, I'm sure there'd be a lot of hem and hawing. But when you actually look, if you would just ignore what the people would say and you would just look at their practice, right? It's kind of like, Jesus says, you'll know them by their fruit. It's like you can tell what someone believes by what they do, right? Mm-hmm. If you just look at what they do, that indicates something quite different, So you walk into, you've been working on some project, you walk into a critique with your like the creative director or whatever. They would look through it and be like, okay, this looks great, this is a little too confusing, here the hierarchy's off, so it's like pushing you over here, there's not enough contrast, it seems like it's tilting a little balance wise over here. And that conversation presupposes all of these things that you should know. And if you were to go in there and be like, well, I just have a different view of balance, then it would just be like crickets and be like, oh, I don't know if you should be working here, because of course the whole assumption are these things that this is everything you should know this exists in the world. So that's kind of like all of these things folded in. And then I was like, you know what, I would just love to, write something on this, like a simple primer, because I think there are these things it's not difficult. It's not confusing. These are things that anyone can understand. And so I started, and I'm in the midst of writing this book on just an intro to a Christian guide to beauty and design, where we just kind of walk through these different properties of beauty.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I think for a lot of us, we think about beauty and it's just kind of nebulous, and we don't really have a very definitive view on what it is and how God relates to it. So that's really cool to hear about that project.
I think one of the big problems is that when you have theologians start to write about beauty, they don't have any sort of technical formal training in any subject that appertains to beauty, right? So they're typically not musicians or interior designers or graphic designers or anything. So in a sense, it's like, well, why would you know anything about this if you didn't, unless you like had a disciplined study of this thing?
Right. Never thought about that before.
So in doing that, you have this YouTube series about the different elements that you're going to be putting in this book. And so I'm curious about just kind of how the YouTube channel in general started, and what that process has been like.
Sure. Yeah. So it's interesting because there are sort of a couple different parts to the YouTube channel and types of content on there. I started off at saying, I'm just interested in beauty, right? I'm interested in form in all its forms, and like skillfulness. And so, the channel started out it's called The Bible as Art, right? And the idea is the main thing has to do with I make videos about the literary artistry of the Bible. So this is just the same thing. It's about the form of the Bible and how the form matches and communicates the content, right? The form and content are one thing, and these things are intricately related. And there's as much attention by the biblical writers to the form of something as to its content, because we can sometimes feel, and I don't know where this is from, maybe some sort of Puritanism, I don't know the history of this, but like we've come to believe that beauty is this like epiphenomena, this like thing that's floating on the surface. It's nice, it's pretty, but extremely non-essential, right? Which is just 100% false. So the channel is, I make videos about the literary artistry of the Bible, and then also on artistry and other spheres. So this whole series on beauty, I make some things on film, and just anywhere where you have beauty kind of skillfully executed. Like I'm always fascinated. I had a friend who was a piano performance major, and I remember watching him in college. And I like got so excited whenever I would see him do it. He's like one of these guys that could sight read anything, and I would watch him. And whenever I saw him do it, like be really skillful at what he is, I was like, man, I want to do what I do really well. Like, and it was just this kind of like natural, I think like image of God type thing where it's like, oh gosh, I want to be like that, because he was just so much better at everything than I was, So yeah, so that's the channel. I got it started because I think that the Bible is a wildly sophisticated and beautiful and profound and multi-layered piece of literature, and we are often looking for moral nuggets, right? And be like, hey, we got to get to the meat, and then we don't have to pay as much attention to the husk of it. And I'm like, no, it's the whole thing, and like the content is communicated in, by, with, and under the form, right? And so that's what the channel is about.
That's awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing about that, and just your creative development behind that, and that's super cool to hear. I think a great place that we always start, and this is the main crux and question that we're after, and that you're after in your book and in your YouTube series, but just like, what are some of those core elements of beauty? What are some questions that arise when asking that big overarching question? What are some thoughts that you might have just within that question itself?
Yeah. Okay. So, in the large majority of the book is about the properties of beauty. Now, if people are not acquainted with this kind of language, a property is just an attribute, a feature of something. And so for anything to be what it is, it has a set of properties, right? So if you're talking about a dog or a chair, those just have a bunch of properties that constitute it as that thing. And beauty is no different. And anyone in, any artistic design field know this very well. And so I talk about mostly things that are cross-disciplinary. So these are features of beautiful or well-designed, or whatever language you want to use, skillfully done works of art that cut across the visual arts, music, any type of narrative art. These are universal features. So it's not particular to each thing, because when you get into each discipline, there's going to be, things like in music, there's timbre, that you don't have in literature, right? And there's going to be particular things, but there are universals that cut across. And so, and one other sort of caveat as we go in here, this list that I'm giving is not by any means universal. Beauty, like anything, is deep and it's profound, and I will not come to the end of it, nor will anyone. But that doesn't, just because we can't know everything doesn't mean we can't know some things about it, and that's true with like every part of the physical world. So you can talk about grass, right? But have you explained everything about grass? Well, no, obviously not, right? So the properties that we can chat through a little bit today are unity, diversity, hierarchy, layers or depth or complexity, balance, and form. Now, when we talk through all these, and part of what started my journey thinking about this and actually thinking about that I should actually write something on it was when I first started thinking about those two first aesthetic properties of beauty, right? That is unity and diversity. And what I found so fascinating about this is that both at the beginning of the church and the beginning of philosophical thinking, if you take, like a history of philosophy class, these questions of unity and diversity were fundamental in those discussions, which I just found to be like this fascinating confluence. Well, what do I mean? I mean, so when you're making a work, okay, if you're making a piece of music, you open up a blank sheet of music. Okay, if you're designing a brochure, you open up InDesign or Illustrator, and you've got a blank page. And so you start off with a type of unity. Now it's not very interesting. There's nothing there, but it's unified. And so you add something, an F, right? A background of pale green, right? And then you add something else, a bunch of type. You add in an A, right? Well, okay. All of a sudden, now you have two elements, okay? And that's and those two elements and each additional thing, the skillfulness of the artist consists in their ability to keep adding things and having it be unified, right? So if you've got an F and an A, right? There's tons of caveats once again, but all of a sudden you've restricted the number of key signatures you're able to play in, right? If you've added one type, you can't use any type else with it, right? Or one color, you're not going to have infinite colors, right? And so all of a sudden you're restricting yourself, right? But we find in ourselves a need for both unity and diversity. Why? Well, because if something is not unified, you don't know that it's one thing, right? Mm-hmm. You want to communicate that this thing is one unified type of thing. If it's not diverse enough, then it's boring. So you have to do both of these things, and the skill of the artist is determined by one's ability to maintain unity within diversity, right? Now, in the beginning of the church, you have this same question. You have Jesus, and one of the first questions of the church is, well, you have Jesus now, and we're worshiping him, and we have all these biblical texts. How does he relate to God the Father, right? Which is just a question of unity and diversity, right? How do we account for unity in this diverse situation? All right. In the beginning of philosophical history, you have what philosophers call the problem of the one and the many, right? And this is normally described between two figures, Parmenides and Heraclitus. And Heraclitus thought that everything was actually flux. It was everything was changeable, that there isn't an underlying unity. And Parmenides thought the opposite, that everything that changes is just sort of like surface reality. But if you really dug down deep, you'd see that there is a principle of unity. Okay, so both of these traditions are struggling with this question, and the answer to this question is, the Christian answer is that both unity and diversity are equal and ultimate. This was a big emphasis of the theologian Cornelius Van Til, who wrote a lot about this, and he was saying, the doctrine of the Trinity solves this philosophical problem because it says neither, because the difficulty that comes in is that if you choose one or the other, then you're going to have to derive one from the other. So if unity is primary, then you're going to have some sort of account as to how diversity was generated. And that's very difficult, right? Because if you have some other principle, then that means it was not a complete unity, sort of, right? Or if you have a diversity, like you have to have an account of another thing that brings it into unity. But then you're like, well, was that primary too? So you have all these philosophical problems, and the Christian answer to this was like, oh, these are both equal and ultimate issues, right? This is this question has been written about by other modern theologians, named Colin Gunton. He wrote a book called The One, the Three, and the Many. But this also gives us an account for why we find these to be aesthetic properties. Why? Because, and this is the sort of core thesis of the book, is that every fundamental aesthetic property was first a property, an attribute of God himself, right? So we find a need for this because we're made in God's image. This is God's world, and this is the structure of things. God is both unified and he is diverse, and what he has made is both unified and diverse. So what we make should be unified and diverse, right? And so when we work and we work through these properties, and and the properties we're talking about are just these ones that are kind of universally accepted. This is no new insight on my part. I mean, these are things that painters and sculptors and musicians have been talking about forever. So those are the first two, and I think in many ways fundamental properties, attributes of beauty that are ultimately found in God.
So, if we recognize that God is truth, right? God is good, and also God is beautiful, then beauty and the way we talk about beauty should also find its roots ultimately in God's character. And so far we've talked about unity and diversity. And John, you just mentioned how the Trinity brings those into the attributes of God. I'm curious what you'd say about the other four and how each of them relate to God's nature.
Yeah, sure. So the next one is hierarchy, and hierarchy. So this is, and this is once again is one of the fundamental aesthetic features in any art. Now, it gets a bad name today, but the funny thing is that because it gets a bad name because there's an assumption that if there is a hierarchy, which another name for this is just order, if there is an order, then whatever is primary of first hierarchical importance will always dominate, oppress what is secondary or tertiary. Now, I mean, there's no reason to believe that, right? I mean, it's kind of taken for granted today, but there's no reason to believe it. And the other thing is that, people don't realize how fundamental hierarchy is in the world. So if you think about literally every business that exists is hierarchical.
Sure.
Right. Yeah. Like one of the things, like you'll hear people say in like business world, like one of the most fundamental things you do is to understand your org chart. That is, understand your hierarchy, and of course everything can be corrupted, right? Sin can corrupt anything. So that's nothing profound to say that, oh yeah, you can, if you are in authority, you can, abuse those under you. Well, yeah, but there's nothing terribly interesting about that, or like revolutionary or anything. But when a hierarchy goes well, it's a beautiful and effective and wonderful thing. So what is hierarchy? It's just that some things are before others, right? And we normally think this primarily in terms, when you hear hierarchy, the other problem is we normally just think about it in terms of like ontological hierarchy. So something is of more ontological value. It's worth more. So be like, oh, if I'm hierarchically over Riker, that means I'm more valuable than he is. But there's tons of types of hierarchy, right? So you can have hierarchies in height, or hierarchies in direction or color, or, whatever it is. And so there's, thousands of types of hierarchy. And when and the whole idea of hierarchy is to be able for things to be peaceful, to be ordered, to be to have a logos, a reason and a purpose. Because what it does, like for instance in design, you if you're making a poster for a concert, you want the hierarchy to reflect the actual content, the importance of the information that needs to be communicated, right? So you want the title to be big. If there are important performers in there, that you want to be big. And once again, this is determined about the nature of the thing. There's always a purpose and a goal and a telos. So you need to understand what it is. So maybe the title isn't the first thing of hierarchical importance. Maybe you have Lin-Manuel Miranda in this, and you're saying, no, that's the most important thing because that's going to get people to actually come. And the fact that it's, let's say Phantom of the Opera is actually of secondary importance. Like, okay, well, that changes our aesthetic decisions we have to make. And it changes the way we're going to form this hierarchy, because then his name is going to have hierarchical importance. And maybe that's by size, maybe that's by color, maybe it's by contrast, maybe it's by a pattern. These are all the decisions that need to be made, right? Similarly in music, if you're writing for like a quartet, you have to make decisions about who's going to have the melody. You want to make sure that the harmony is not hierarchically more important. Namely, one is you don't want it to be more interesting. You don't want it to be louder, right? You don't not want it to contrast too much, right? and you'll hear these things, and if the hierarchy's off, you get the feeling like there's something malformed here, right? Something needs to be changed because it's not peaceful, right? It's not. There's when things are well designed. There's a podcast that I'm not sure if you guys have heard it before, but called 99% Invisible, and it's a podcast on design. And the idea is that when things are well designed, they you don't notice them because they're serving their role. They're sitting in peacefully to their place on the hierarchy, we could say, right?
Yeah.
And so you think about things when they go wrong, when a doorknob is on the wrong side of the door, when you feel like it should push and it pulls, right? When things are improperly designed, you don't notice them. But when things are designed, because we normally, like when you think about design, right, we're like, oh, Apple, right? But I'm like, you want to think about design? Look around your room. Screws, wheels, plywood, drywall. I mean, like drywall didn't exist like 100 years ago, and now all of our buildings, right? That's an ingenious invention. But you don't think about it because it's serving its purpose so well. It's sitting within the hierarchy well. You're not paying attention to your wall, right? It's found its place and it's perfect there. So you're just thinking about the order and how the order of the things corresponds to their nature, right? And what do we have in God? We have a hierarchy. Now once again, it's not an ontological hierarchy, but we have an order of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. A Father, then the Son, then the Spirit. Now, there's all sort of theological questions nowadays, debates that are going on as be like about the functional subordination of the Son. But you can just table all that. There's no decisions that you have to make on that. There just simply is an order. You have a Father first, and then you have a Son, right? So whatever you want to call that, whatever type of order or hierarchy you want to call that, that's fine. But there is an order, right? The Father is not the Son is not the Father, and neither are the Spirit. So that's hierarchy. Then we get down to what I call layers. Another way, there are a couple different things that people describe. We can describe it as complexity or depth. And one of the fascinating things I find is that, and this is kind of combined with simplicity as well. Right. So we both find the need for things to be simple and complex. And so we want them to be simple, which means that they have no excess. They are precisely what they are, and there's nothing unnecessary there. It is in an ideal form. But we also at the same time want things to be layered and deep and complex. We don't want to exhaust things upon first seeing or first hearing. You know, you want your wife to be both physically and intellectually and spiritually beautiful, right? We even have a trope of someone who is just physically attractive and only physically attractive, right? And like a bimbo. Like we have created this character that trades upon the fact of the malformedness of someone who lacks complexity, right? Who is only simple. And when you look in the world, I mean, this is one of the most fascinating things, I think. When you look at the world, God has constructed the world in layers. You know, so when you go off to college and you sit down with a registrar, and they're like, okay, what do you want to study? And you can't just be like, the world. They're like, oh, no. You got to like choose a layer. And you're like, what? You're like, yeah, you just got to like choose a layer. So it's like you could do like biology, or you could go like one layer down chemistry, or a layer down physics, right? And so you have these like, and these aren't just sort of human constructions, right? In each of those layers, there's a world with a set of properties and rules and, you know, equations. Like it's a structure there. And so we have created these disciplines because we happen to have found that there's a coherent world there, right? We're not just being like, oh, I don't know, physics, and just like randomly throwing a bunch of pieces. It'd be like, no. It actually works well when you isolate this strata and study it, right? And so the world, God has created the world in layers. He's created things complexly. Now complexly is not just, it still needs to be unified, back to our first discussion, but there are layers. And so you can discover more things when you look. And this reminds me of in the Proverbs. Like the Proverbs are like this fascinating thing because we sometimes think about the Proverbs as these sort of like simple moral aphorisms. You know, it's like you got this thing in your pocket. And in a sense, that's like 50% correct, because they are meant to be simple and memorable and to be able to take with you and wield at any moment. But the fascinating thing is that when you move on in the book of Proverbs, the Proverbs actually get more complex. And so you have these sort of two main chunks of Proverbs in the book of Proverbs. And the first main chunk starts out with a proverb that says something like, I don't remember exactly how it goes, like an unrighteous son is a sorrow to his mother, you know, and makes an unhappy father, or something to that degree, right? So you're like, oh yeah, I get that. Okay, so like if you're just like a foolish son, then your mom and dad aren't going to be happy. Cool. Then you switch over into the latter half of the book, and you look at the second major large collection of Proverbs, and the one that opens up that section says this. This is Proverbs 25:2. It is the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings to search things out. You're like, what? and it's like, wait, what happened to be a good son and your parents are going to be happy? And now God's straight up like, I'm hiding things. You're like, oh, okay. Something has changed, right? And the whole point, because the whole point of Proverbs is that you have this son, this literary son, who is maturing throughout the book, right? And as you mature, you deal with deeper and more complex issues. Answer a fool according to his folly. Answer not a fool according to his folly. What? Do I answer or not? It depends, right? Do I be a wise or foolish son? Wise, right? That's clear. But when you come across a fool, sometimes you got to answer him and sometimes not. It sort of depends. And you need to read the situation. You need to have the ability to read the layers and the complexity, right? And so this is a feature of God. I mean, like we talk about progressive revelation, right? So the way that God has communicated himself to us is progressively, it's over time, and it goes deeper. Or Paul will say, how unsearchable are God's ways. We haven't exhausted God. We certainly have a knowledge of God, but it grows throughout our lives as we move through Scripture. And so this is a feature of God, his depth or his complexity. But also there's a simplicity there. There's a sort of pristineness of form. There's not an excess. There's an ease. You know, like I find that one of the fascinating things about all beauty, but it's Scripture in particular, is that there is a very simple surface, right? I mean, you can understand large chunks of the Bible when you're a very young child, and this is actually a feature of I think this is a feature of true genius. So sometimes we associate, like when we say, hey, who's a genius? You're like, oh, Einstein, Newton, right? Because we think about math, and we think about science, and we think about confusing language. But the fascinating thing is when you think about who are the people who we exalt, sort of universally exalt, you know, Plato and Aristotle and Shakespeare, they actually have this very simple surface to them, right? You know, Plato writes in dialogues or stories, and apparently he's one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived, right? No philosophers write in stories anymore. Why is that? Right? And so it's I always characterize it like this: like if you were to go to Einstein or just some physics person, and they write you a paper, and you say, okay, great. Now I want you to explain this to an 11-year-old kid. A lot of times they'd be like, I can't. Be like, why? Be like, it's too complicated. Be like, okay, so you are a genius and you have found something that's too difficult for you. What is too difficult for you? It is to make it simple, right? And that doesn't mean dumbing down. It means crystallizing. It means getting to the core. I mean, this is a feature of like all great teachers. And this is why I always tell people when they're going into college, don't take young professors, because young professors don't understand often the hierarchy of their subject. They don't understand what's at the core. So you'll take a class on the French Revolution, and you'll come away and you say it's your buddy, and you say, hey, so like, what's the French Revolution about? And they'll be like, I don't really know. They'll be like, well, what do you know about? They're like coins during the French Revolution, because that's what he did his dissertation on, right? That's what he knows about. And so when you don't know something, when you're not skillful in something enough, you don't have the hierarchy. You don't have the main melodic line in your head, you know? So like in music, could be something like, tell me about all this. And you'd be like, it's like, here's the counterpoint, right? And here's like all the changes. You're like, but what's the melody, right? What's the melody? And it takes a skill to be able to crystallize and distill things down to make it simple, not dumbing it down, but to understand what is the core, what's essential, and what's at the second and third and fourth level of hierarchy. You're just moving up and able to identify that top surface, right? Okay, so for balance, so we all have these things that's, you know, things, and balance comes in many forms. And once again, this is cross-disciplinary. So you have balance in music, you have visual balance. You even had, you know, when the Greeks were building their architecture, you know, they made some of the forms of the pillars larger on the top than they were at the bottom, so that there would be visual balance, when people would see them. You have this like vertical visual balance. And in visual compositions, you have what's called balance, or sometimes you have visual weight. But the fascinating thing is, and sometimes we can describe this as like symmetry. But the fascinating thing is that there's both symmetrical and asymmetrical balance. Okay, so balance is not simply this sort of stoic idea of like, everything is perfectly matched 1-to-1 on each side. No, that you can have, and it's hard to describe this without being able to see something. But often for instance, visual design is that if you'll have like a lot of large or heavy things on one side, those need to be balanced out by something on the other side. It doesn't have to be identical. So there is an asymmetry. So there is, but it's symmetrical asymmetry, or it's balanced asymmetry. Okay. And this once again, this is nothing new to me. This is understood. You can Google, asymmetrical balance. But you need things to have rest and ease, that these things aren't going to because the problem when things are off balance is that you're worried what's going to happen, right? And I think that there's many features of God that have this feature of balance that we could think about, whether it's things about like justice and mercy, right? Where these things that that are tricky when you try to get into the weeds of them, but there's a balance there. There's a balance in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? There's a balance there, but there's also an asymmetrical balance, right? You have a balance in the whole biblical narrative, right? You begin in the garden, and then you end in a garden city, and in the middle, you have just the creation, fall, redemption, right? There's a symmetry there.
Yeah.
So that's balance. And then the last thing is that we're going to chat about was form. So once again, when you look at the world, and a lot of this, when you're trying to understand beauty, we want to look at how God has created beautiful things. And one of the fascinating things that he's done is he's created things made out of forms, right? Like unified and individual things. And these things combine together to make greater things. So this sounds really abstract, but we all understand this. So you've got the car, and a car is a form. And a car is made up of subforms. So you have wheels, and the wheels are made out of tires and lug nuts, and right, and those are all forms. And so God has created this thing about of hierarchical forms, and that's the way he's created the world. Now, this was something that was completely accepted until the modern period, when you get like non-representational forms of art, right? And say, well, you don't need to work with forms. Now, the fascinating irony is that you actually can't get away from forms, ultimately, because of a creational constraint. And what I mean by that is, if you think about someone like Jackson Pollock, he's a splatter on the canvas guy. He's working in the line of non-representational art, trying to avoid form. But because you have the literal physical constraints of creation, namely the viscosity of the paint, the constant of gravity, the height at which he drops his paint, when you actually look at his works, there's actually, my guess is, a sort of unintended unity to it that is determined by the constraints of creation. Like, to make something completely chaotic and unformed would be extremely difficult, right? Because you're already, we're always already, in the words of Martin Heidegger, we're always already thrown into the world, right? and this is, it's like we don't start as sort of this like blank slate, but like we are working within a tradition and the physical world, and there are already things here. So, and this was, once again, that this was like a presuppositional, this was an intuitional insight from the earliest times of artistic work through, most of human history. And this is why, most of the things that are depicted are people and animals and nature, right? And that's like totally natural. But then you get to this modern period, and you try to avoid that. And you have a fascinating thing, is that all of a sudden when you get these forms of art, all of a sudden they need like great explanation, right? Because you come to it and you're like, oh, I don't get it. And you're like, oh, well, if you understood the context in which this was made, blah, 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 blah. And you're like, okay, I guess. But it's like, but you can look at, the statue of David, and there's, because the thing about when you have something that has all these properties about its hierarchy and its simplicity, beauty has this sort of like immediate attraction to it. Like if you see a beautiful woman, you don't need an argument, you don't need a story. And if you do, it's almost as like something's wrong, right? Like your faculties have been malformed in some way, because you are unable to see this thing which is most obvious in the world, right? So, and once again, this is the way that it is in the world because God himself has, or more properly is, form. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, he is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He's not amorphous, right? Somehow we've come to believe that when you ascend up to God, that things are like ethereal and like hazy. But I'm like, I don't know where this presupposition came in, because when let's say we knew nothing, say you weren't a Christian and you were just trying to like figure out the world, and you'd be like, okay, as I'm ascending up and I get into more higher forms, let's say, and so you're thinking about morals and the structure of the ethical life, and you're thinking about God, would you presuppose that this would be determinate, particular, formed, or would you think that it would be indeterminate, amorphous? You're like, okay, well, what do you have to work on? Well, you've only got the physical world, right? That's the only thing that you have to reason from. And when you look at the physical world, it's this like wildly structured and interesting and complex thing. And so why, when you ascend, would you assume anything different about God and his nature? But for some reason, people think that, I don't know, because it's more abstract in certain ways, that all of a sudden it's less, formful, has a form, right? No, but God has a very particular nature, right? He does things, he does not do other things. He speaks in certain ways, he does not speak in other ways. He is Father, Son, and Spirit. He is not Father, Son, and Mother, right? So all of these, so the big picture is that when you look at all of these aesthetic properties, they find their ultimate form in God himself. And so we have a need, because we are made in his image, the God who is the original for all of these aesthetic forms.
Yeah, no, I think it's so true. And I think that like it, even with that sort of approach, it brings in how beautiful, for lack of a better term, just like the uniqueness is of each individual, and how different our gift sets are, if you will. And that if you look at creation as a whole, and in all of the facets that you've just been talking about, like it brings to life this new order, because there are people that are in specific professions that have like ideas about certain things that you can, again, then spew. So I could just go on the spiel about modes for hours, but again, somebody who wasn't as familiar with something like that would not be able to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and we have language for this in music, theme and variation, right?
Right.
That's all it is.
Yes.
And you're like, oh, that's like everyone. Like that's part of the structure of the world. Like everyone is like, there's like a theme, and then everyone is a variation on that theme. Like you have a particular permutation of gifts that's fitting into the composition in this particular way.
Yeah. Wow. That's super good.
Yeah. This stuff is definitely mind-blowing, and it's really cool, John, to hear about just some tangible ways to, like you said, not understand all of beauty, but really get some handholds on what beauty looks like. And so for those of you who are listening who are really intrigued by this idea, and especially how it relates to God, I think a really cool project that you could do is take this grid of the 6 different fundamental properties and map those onto creation, the tabernacle, the Bible, and New Jerusalem. Because each of those are, in our Christian understanding of things, beautiful, and they have these properties just laced all throughout. So yeah, I'd encourage you to think about that.
Yeah. And I think our final question that should be answered or tried to be answered this episode is just how should we respond? How should we respond to all of this, and how can we go forth in our daily lives and cultivate this grand idea of beauty?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's a few things. So the first thing is, in the Proverbs, the word for wisdom just means skill. All right, and it first pops up in the tabernacle about how the skillfulness of Aholiab and Bezalel and their construction of the tabernacle, and wisdom in the Proverbs is just skill at life, right? And so what we're talking about here is just skillfulness in forming the world. It could be everything from like forming your home, forming like everything in your life, having it be well formed, and thinking about these things. Because if these things are ultimately reflections of God and his nature, then you are forming the world after his image, right? So when you're thinking about these things in your home, and like think about this like architecturally, brutalism in architecture was very popular, and it's still very much with us in many ways. That's we've all seen these like just concrete, cubes that some people call architecture, and this was very influential, and it made its way into a lot of work buildings in America. And they were dark, and they were, and there was like, these studies about like suicide rates, and simply because of the way that you're designing light and the way that you're designing space and all of these things. And you can look at these buildings and you can lay, like Riker said, this grid of understanding it on there, and just be like, and you look at those buildings and immediately you're like, oh, those are boring. That means there's not enough diversity here, right? And you could immediately solve many of these problems with just sort of basic understanding of what makes something beautiful, and it can save lives, right? And so, but you can apply this to all of life. And so even things that you don't like for instance, like I don't know anything about interior design, but if you understand aesthetic fundamental principles, then you can go into and you can start reasoning about these things. Well, it should be like, okay, well, is this thing balanced enough, right? Is there enough elements to make it interesting? Is it too unified, right? And you can start forming your world in your life that is more beautiful and reflects God more fully.
Yeah, that's a really helpful way of looking at it. And as Christians, if we accept the idea that we should be at the forefront of topics like beauty, because we have, a purpose behind it, this really helps to crystallize that. So I really appreciate it. Thanks again, John, for coming on the podcast. It has been an absolute pleasure. And for those of you who are interested in learning more John has an entire series about this on his YouTube channel, The Bible is Art. And he has a bunch of incredible videos that talk about the literary design of Scripture. If you like the content on this podcast, you'll really like the stuff that he has. So make sure to go check that out.
Hey guys, thanks so much. This was really great.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of The Theology Of. If you want to check out my channel, The Bible is Art, you can just go to youtube.com/thebibleisart or my website, thebibleisart.com. We really appreciate you checking out this episode and our conversations thus far. If you want more information and any of the resources used for today's episode, you can check them out in the show notes below. If you have any thoughts or questions, feel free to email them to thetheologyof@outlook.com. Thanks again so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.